My son posted a photo from Rome, smiling under the Italian sun, the same day I was lying in a hospital bed, alone, hooked to machines. Tell me, what kind of child celebrates life while their mother is fighting to stay alive? If you've ever felt invisible, stay till the end. This story is for you. My name is Margaret Holden, and I turned 74 last winter. That morning, I woke up in a white hospital room in Portland, Maine. The walls hummed with the sound of machines that measured life in soft, blinking lights. My mouth was dry, my body heavy, and my first thought was not about pain, but about silence. No one was there. The chair beside my bed sat empty, its vinyl seat creased from nights long gone when my husband used to wait through every appointment with a crossword in his lap. The nurse came in quietly, adjusting the tubes that climbed from my arm like pale vines. "You had a mild stroke," she said. "You're very lucky." Lucky? What a strange word to use when your heart feels hollow. I nodded politely, watching her kindness through a fog of exhaustion. When she left, the room felt colder. I could hear another patient's television murmuring behind the curtain, someone laughing at a daytime talk show. For me, there was no laughter, no flowers, no voice saying, "Mom, we're here." By afternoon, I pressed the call button. "Has anyone called for me?" I asked. The nurse hesitated, her eyes softened with pity, that quiet kind that hurts more than the truth. "No, not yet," she said. Then, as she turned to leave, she paused. "Maybe they're still traveling." "Traveling?" I repeated, the word strange in my mouth. "Who?" She frowned, as if realizing she had said too much. "I overheard another nurse mention it this morning. Your family, your son and daughter. They're in Italy, I think." Italy. The name cracked something open inside me. My throat tightened, but no tears came. Instead, I stared at the monitor beside me, the green line rising and falling, proof that I was still here. Somewhere across the ocean, my children were smiling for photographs under the Tuscan sun, while I lay in a hospital bed, waiting for someone to notice I existed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fluorescent lights hummed above me like angry bees. Every few minutes, the monitor beeped, reminding me of my own heartbeat, stubbornly continuing without permission. I imagined Andrew's laugh echoing in some foreign cafe, Rebecca's voice calling for another glass of wine. I pictured their hands holding passports, not my own trembling one. The betrayal was too quiet to scream about. It seeped in slowly, like water through stone. By the second morning, I started to lie to myself. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe Chloe had sent a message and it hadn't reached me. I reached for my phone, its screen cracked and lifeless. The charger had slipped from the wall overnight. When I finally turned it on, the truth flashed in blue light. Not a single missed call, not a single message. Just one photo on social media of Andrew and Chloe standing before the Colosseum, their faces radiant. The caption read, "Finally taking the trip of a lifetime." My thumb trembled over the heart icon, but I didn't touch it. I closed the phone instead and stared at the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and soundless. It looked peaceful from afar, but I knew how bitter that cold could feel when it pressed against your skin. A volunteer came by later with a tray of books. "Would you like something to read, Mrs. Holden?" she asked kindly. I almost said yes, but then I stopped myself. My eyes couldn't focus on words that day. My mind was already replaying every choice I had made that led me here. Every meal cooked, every birthday remembered, every bill paid. All the invisible things mothers do, all the things that keep a family together until the family decides they no longer need keeping. I stared at the IV fluid dripping steadily into my arm. Each drop was like a second passing, each one filled with quiet questions. Why didn't they call? Did they even know? Did they care? That night, as the nurse dimmed the lights, she smiled at me gently. "Try to rest, dear," she said. Rest. I almost laughed. Resting meant trusting that someone would be there when you woke up. I turned to the window again. Snowflakes gathered on the sill like tiny ghosts of every unspoken word. Somewhere across the world, my family slept under Italian skies. And here I was, still breathing, still waiting, still hoping that maybe tomorrow someone would remember I existed. But the phone stayed silent. The chair beside my bed stayed empty. And as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of the machines, I finally understood that silence can be the loudest betrayal of all. When the doctor came in the next morning and told me I was strong enough to go home, I nodded. I smiled. I thanked him. But something inside me had already changed. Because I knew the truth now. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. What I didn't know yet was that the silence I feared most would soon become the thing that set me free. I wish I could tell you that walking through my front door felt like coming home, but it didn't. It felt like stepping into a stranger's life that had been abandoned mid-sentence. The air inside was heavy and stale, as though even time had stopped to mourn. I set my hospital bag on the floor and stood still for a long while, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The house was colder than I remembered. Not the kind of cold you fix with a blanket, but the kind that lives inside the walls. The thermostat blinked in protest, the light red and accusing. I pressed my palm against the radiator, and it answered with silence. The chill seeped upward, crawling through my legs, into my chest. I walked from room to room, touching the surfaces that once held warmth. The piano in the corner was veiled with dust, the mail on the table stacked high and unopened. My plants had wilted into thin, brown whispers. I knelt beside one and touched its stem, soft and hollow. For a moment, I tried to pretend nothing had changed, that Andrew would walk through the door, shake the snow from his coat, and ask if I wanted tea, that Rebecca would call to say she missed me. But the phone stayed quiet. The quiet had teeth. I opened the refrigerator, and a smell of decay spilled out, sour and sharp. Half an orange, forgotten leftovers, a milk carton swollen with age. I threw it all away, each item thudding into the trash like a small betrayal. Then, on the counter, I noticed an envelope lying open, my name printed in blue. The numbers caught my eye first, $7,860. I traced each charge with a trembling finger. Hotels, restaurants, boutiques. The dates matched the week I was in the hospital. I sat down at the kitchen table, my knees suddenly weak. The old silver teapot sat in front of me, the same one my husband used to polish every Sunday morning. Its surface had dulled over the years, but when I leaned close, I could still see my reflection inside it. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 74. Her eyes were tired, her lips drawn tight like she was holding back a storm. That teapot had once poured warmth for our family, steam rising like a small prayer over breakfast. Now it only poured silence. A wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. I stared at the envelope again. They hadn't just left me. They had used me, drained me, and celebrated my absence. I thought of Andrew's laugh, carefree in Italy, while the nurse wiped my forehead with a damp cloth. I thought of Rebecca's polished nails wrapped around a glass of wine while my hands clutched the hospital sheets. I tried to summon anger, but all I found was emptiness. Anger burns fast. Betrayal freezes slowly. I spent the next few hours tidying the house in a daze. I collected unopened mail, swept the floor, changed the bed sheets, simple motions that made me feel like a person again. Among the letters were overdue notices, reminders of things they were supposed to handle while I was gone. I found a water bill marked final warning. They had let everything slide. It struck me then that their love had faded long before their absence did. As the sun began to set, the last light slipped through the curtains, painting the dust in golden streaks. I sat again at the table, teapot before me, and listened to the house breathe. Every creak of the wood sounded like a voice whispering what I already knew. Something inside this home had died, and it wasn't me. Night came early. I made myself tea out of habit, the ritual automatic. When I poured the hot water, a faint hiss filled the room. It was the first sound of life I had heard all day. I took a sip, but the taste was bitter. I set the cup down, unable to finish. The quiet pressed harder. I reached for my phone, scrolling through photos of my children. Their faces smiled back, frozen in time, holding gifts I had bought, standing in rooms I had cleaned. I wondered if any of those smiles were real, or if they had been rehearsed for the camera. My thumb hovered over Andrew's number, then Rebecca's. I could call, demand an explanation, ask how they could spend my money while I lay between beeping machines. But I knew the answer would hurt more than the silence. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom. The sheets were still in a tangled heap from the morning the ambulance came. My slippers waited neatly at the foot of the bed, like loyal soldiers. I sat down, tracing the fabric of the quilt my mother had made when I was a girl. It was worn thin but warm in memory. My husband's pillow still carried the faint scent of his aftershave, though he'd been gone for years. I closed my eyes and imagined his voice, calm and steady. He had always been the one who knew what to do. But there was no voice now, only my own breathing, uneven and sharp. I told myself I would sleep. That morning would bring clarity. Instead, I lay awake counting the cracks on the ceiling, each one marking a year of holding things together. The house groaned under the wind, as if it too was tired of pretending to be whole. Sometime after midnight, I heard the faint chime of the old grandfather clock in the hall. 12 times it rang, each note softer than the last. I turned toward the teapot still on the table, its outline visible through the doorway. The moonlight struck it just right, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw my husband's reflection beside mine, smiling, nodding. Then the shadow faded. I realized then that the home I had protected all my life no longer protected me. It was just walls and memories now, hollow and indifferent. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and relentless, covering everything it touched. Inside, I decided that tomorrow I would not wait for anyone to call. Tomorrow, I would start listening to the silence, not as punishment, but as proof that I was still here. I did not know yet that the silence had one more secret to reveal, one that would change everything about what home truly meant. The next morning came gray and silent, the kind of winter morning that hides the sun behind a dull sheet of clouds. I stood in my kitchen robe, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had already gone cold. The air felt heavy with something unnamed. I had not slept much, though I could not remember what thoughts had kept me awake. My mind felt foggy, as if part of me was still lying in that hospital bed, waiting for a door to open. Then I heard it, a soft, measured knock at the front door. For a second, my heart leapt. It was ridiculous, really. How quickly hope can crawl back in even when you think you've buried it. I set the mug down and walked to the door. Mrs. Grant stood there, her cheeks pink from the cold, a scarf looped twice around her neck, and in her hands a loaf of bread wrapped in a blue cloth. "I saw the ambulance that night," she said quietly. "I thought Andrew would be here by now." Her voice was careful, gentle, the way nurses speak when they already know the answer. I took the bread and nodded. "He didn't come," I said, almost surprised at how calm my voice sounded. Something flickered in her eyes, not shock, but understanding. "Then maybe it's time you stopped waiting." Her words fell between us like a small, glowing ember. She smiled, patted my arm, and turned to leave. The scent of the bread lingered after she was gone, warm and faintly sweet. I stood in the open doorway for a long time, staring at the snow gathering along the edges of the porch. Those words echoed in my head again and again. "Maybe it's time you stopped waiting." I carried the bread to the table and cut a small piece. The crust crackled softly under the knife. I buttered it, tasted it, and realized I had not eaten in almost a day. The bread was still warm inside, soft and alive, and for a moment, I felt something loosen inside my chest. That afternoon, I wrapped myself in a coat and decided to walk. The air outside was sharp, the kind that makes you aware of every breath. The neighborhood looked unchanged, yet different. The Johnson kids were building a crooked snowman across the street, their laughter echoing down the block. The Grants' house stood neatly trimmed, smoke curling from the chimney. I stopped at the edge of my driveway. The snow had hidden the tire marks that had once led home. It looked untouched, like a blank page. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, it didn't hurt. As I walked, my mind began to wander through memories. There was a time when my door had never stopped opening. When Andrew was young, he'd run down this very path after school, snow on his lashes, holding up his report card. Rebecca used to sit by the window, drawing pictures of the moon. Those images felt like old postcards now, faded and untouchable. I passed Mrs. Grant's house again on my way back. Through the window, I could see her watering plants, humming to herself. She looked peaceful. I wondered if she had ever been forgotten too, or if she had simply learned to make peace with solitude. Perhaps the difference between loneliness and freedom is simply choice. When I returned home, I placed the half loaf of bread beside the silver teapot on the counter. The two things looked strange together. One symbol of warmth freshly given, the other a relic of warmth long gone. I ran my fingers along the teapot's handle, and the metal felt cold against my skin. I thought about polishing it again, the way my husband used to, but instead, I just stood there, staring at my reflection in its dull surface. That evening, the sky turned lavender and then darkened to navy. I switched on a single lamp in the living room and sat near the window. The snow kept falling, each flake landing soundlessly, as if careful not to disturb the quiet. Mrs. Grant's words had followed me all day. Stop waiting. What did that even mean? I had been waiting for so long that waiting had become its own habit. I waited for birthdays that went unacknowledged. I waited for visits that never came. I waited for the sound of a phone ringing that would not ring. Waiting had filled the spaces where love should have been. Without it, what would I even have left? Yet that night, something inside me shifted. A thought, small but steady, began to take root. If no one was coming, then perhaps I could start walking toward myself instead. I wasn't sure what that meant yet, but it made my heart beat faster, as if my body understood before my mind did. I got up and moved through the house, touching the things I had once kept for others. The piano no one played, the framed photo of Andrew's wedding that had been hanging slightly crooked for years, the shelf of cookbooks Rebecca had said she would take one day. Each item whispered a question. Are you ready to let go? In the hallway, I stopped before the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the same one who had gone into the hospital. Her eyes were clearer, her mouth set differently, as though she had finally realized something she could not yet name. I reached out and touched the mirror's edge, almost expecting her to move first. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing against the windows like a distant call. I listened to it, and in that sound, I heard something I hadn't heard in a long time. Possibility. Before I went to bed, I tore a page from my old notepad and wrote down a sentence I didn't fully understand, but felt true. If they can leave you, you can leave too. I placed the note beside the teapot, next to the loaf of bread. The two symbols stared back at me, one born from kindness, the other from memory. Somewhere between them, a decision was forming, and though I could not see it clearly yet, that decision would soon change everything about what I thought love was meant to be. The morning after I wrote that note, I woke to the sound of my own heartbeat. It was strange how quiet the world could feel when you finally stopped expecting it to answer back. The snow outside had begun to melt, trickling down the gutters in thin silver streams. For the first time in weeks, sunlight reached through the window and touched the kitchen floor. It fell across the teapot, across the half loaf of bread, and finally, over the note I had written in the dark. The ink had smudged a little, but the words were still clear enough to read. If they can leave you, you can leave too. I don't know what possessed me to pick up the phone that morning. Perhaps it was the sunlight, or perhaps it was the memory of Mrs. Grant's voice telling me to stop waiting. My hands did not shake this time when I dialed. The man on the other end sounded cheerful, like someone who fixed more than just doors for a living. "We can send someone this morning, ma'am," he said. When the van pulled up in front of the house, I felt an unexpected flutter in my chest, like a secret I wasn't ready to share. The locksmith stepped out, a young man with steady hands and kind eyes. He introduced himself as Daniel, which made me smile for a reason I couldn't explain. My own son was named Andrew, but for a brief, foolish second, I imagined him at my door, coming to make things right. "Show me where you'd like the new locks, ma'am," the locksmith said, pulling his toolbox from the van. "All of them," I replied. My voice surprised me. It sounded firm, almost unfamiliar. Every door, every entry point. He nodded once, without question. As he worked, the sound of metal filled the house, soft at first, then rhythmic. The drills whirred, the screws tightened, and each click of his tools echoed like a pulse. The scent of polished steel and oil mixed with the faint aroma of bread still lingering in the air. I followed him from room to room, watching as he removed the old locks. Each one came loose easily, like a weight being lifted. I thought about all the times my children had let themselves in without knocking, dropping coats on the chairs, opening the refrigerator, walking through my space as though it were theirs to command. The house had been a revolving door for their needs and moods, but never for mine. At one point, the locksmith looked up and smiled. "This house has good bones," he said. "It will last a long time." "So will I," I answered quietly, almost to myself. He didn't ask questions, though I could tell he wanted to. Instead, he went back to work, humming under his breath, something soft and unrecognizable. When he finally finished, he handed me a small envelope with 3 shiny new keys inside. "These will work for every door," he said, Keep one safe, just in case. The keys glinted in my palm, heavier than they should have been. I turned them over, feeling the ridges under my fingertips. They were cool, smooth, precise, a symbol of closure, but also of something beginning. Do you ever think, I asked suddenly, that locks aren't just to keep people out, but to keep yourself in? He paused, looking at me for the first time with something like understanding. Sometimes, ma'am, he said, it's both. After he left, I stood in the doorway, holding the new keys tightly. The wind outside had picked up, scattering snowflakes like ash. I closed the door and turned the lock for the first time. The click was sharp and satisfying. It was the sound of a boundary being redrawn, a line between what I had tolerated and what I would no longer allow. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the house. I opened every window, letting the cold air rush through, clearing away the stale scent of waiting. I polished the silver teapot until it gleamed, though it still reflected the same tired eyes. I placed the new keys beside it, the two objects side by side, one a relic of devotion, the other a mark of liberation. When evening came, I brewed a fresh pot of tea and carried a cup to the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long yellow paths across the snow. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing, the sound light and far away. I wondered if any of them ever thought about the mothers who waited for their laughter to come home. I sipped the tea slowly, letting it burn my tongue a little. Pain, when chosen, feels different. It sharpens you instead of breaking you. The house felt cleaner, brighter, as if it had been holding its breath and was finally allowed to exhale. That night, I locked the front door again before bed. The motion was simple, ordinary, but it felt sacred. I whispered to the empty hallway, "No one comes in without being invited." The house answered in silence, but it was no longer the heavy kind. It felt like listening instead of mourning. I went to sleep with the keys under my pillow, their shape pressing gently against the fabric. It reminded me that safety can be something you build, not something you beg for. Before drifting off, a thought surfaced, clear as glass. Locks are not the end of a story, they are the beginning of a new one. And though I did not yet know where that new story would lead, I knew this much. The next person to open my door would not be someone who took from me, but someone who knocked, waited, and asked to be let in. That night, after locking every door and setting the keys on my nightstand, I lay awake listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock. The sound was steady, almost hypnotic, and yet my mind refused to rest. Sleep came in fragments, flashes of old memories mixed with the cold realization that I was now alone by choice, not by accident. In the morning, the light poured weakly through the kitchen window, the kind of pale winter light that never really warms a room. I sat at the table, staring at the silver teapot. Its surface was so polished now that I could see my reflection clearly, but the woman in it was not the same one who had returned from the hospital a few days earlier. Her eyes were sharper, not cruel but alert, as though she had finally decided to stop pretending not to see. I reached into the drawer and found an old leather-bound notebook. It had once been my husband's ledger for household expenses. He was meticulous about everything, always writing down numbers in perfect rows. I used to tease him for it. Now, I understood the comfort of keeping order when the rest of life felt uncontrollable. I opened the first blank page and held my pen above it. For a moment, I hesitated. There was a part of me that still wanted to believe what had happened was just a misunderstanding, a careless mistake. But truth demands evidence, not hope. So I began. Each line started with a date. Each date matched with a charge. March 4, flight to Rome, $900. That day, I was learning to walk again. March 6, dinner in Florence, $420. That day, I was swallowing pills alone. March 10, hotel suite in Venice, $1,150. That day, the doctor told me I might never regain full strength in my left arm. The ink flowed, slow but deliberate. By the time I filled the first page, my fingers were cramped and stained blue. The numbers looked harmless, but I knew what they represented. Laughter in foreign cities, meals shared under warm lights, all purchased with the quiet ache of my absence. As the hours passed, the smell of ink and paper filled the kitchen. I wrote until the light outside turned from silver to gold, then to gray again. Each word steadied me. Each entry reclaimed a small piece of dignity I hadn't realized I'd lost. When I finally stopped, the ledger was thick with proof. I ran my hand over the pages, feeling the slight ridges where my pen had pressed too hard. My tears had fallen in places, leaving tiny waves in the paper. It was as if the notebook had absorbed not just ink, but memory itself. That night, I sat by the window with the ledger on my lap. The street outside was quiet, the snow reduced to slush at the edges of the sidewalks. I thought about how easy it had been for them to forget me, how easy it had been for me to let them. Love, I realized, can make you blind, but devotion can make you disappear entirely. I turned to a fresh page and began to write something different. Not numbers this time, but words. I wrote about the morning Andrew called to say he had no time to help me with the gutters. About Rebecca's sigh when I asked her to come for Thanksgiving. About the way both of them looked through me at Christmas, as if I were a shadow that spoiled the light. The more I wrote, the clearer I became. For years I had kept quiet, convincing myself that silence was love, that patience was strength. But now, staring at my own handwriting, I saw what silence had cost me. It had given them permission to forget that I was human. I closed the ledger and placed it beside the teapot on the counter. The metal reflected the dim lamplight, soft and steady. For the first time, I saw my reflection not as something fragile, but as something alive. The woman looking back was tired, yes, but she was no longer waiting for someone to save her. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The house was still, the air thick with the faint scent of old paper and brewed tea. I opened the ledger again and added one more note at the bottom of the last page. This is my record, and someday it will be theirs too. I closed it carefully, tied it with a piece of twine, and slipped it into the drawer beside the sink. I didn't need to show it to anyone yet. Truth, I had learned, is patient. It waits until you are ready to hold it without shaking. Later that day, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, glinting off the icy patches along the sidewalk. Mrs. Grant waved from her porch, and I raised my hand in return. For a brief moment, I felt the warmth of connection, fragile but real. When I returned home, I made tea again. The water hissed softly, rising in gentle steam. I poured it into my cup and watched the surface ripple as the tea bag sank. The silver teapot gleamed beside the ledger, the two of them side by side, one carrying warmth, the other truth. I took a slow sip and whispered to myself, they may have taken what I had, but not what I know. Outside, a single bird landed on the porch railing, its feathers bright against the pale sky. It tilted its head, looked directly at me, and then flew away. I watched it disappear over the trees, and for the first time, I understood the strange, quiet freedom that comes from no longer needing to be found. I did not yet realize that the ledger I had created would soon become the first brick in a wall of decisions that would change everything. It was no longer enough to record the truth. I was beginning to feel the pull to act on it. The day I decided to sell the car began like any other, quiet, with the slow hum of morning light creeping across the floorboards. I had just finished breakfast, half a slice of toast and tea, when my eyes landed on the garage door. It had been months since I'd stepped inside. I told myself I was too old to drive, that I preferred walking. The truth was simpler. Every time I looked at that car, I saw a ghost. It was a faded blue Chevy Bel Air, a model from another lifetime. My husband had bought it the year Andrew was born. He said every family needed something that could carry them through both storms and summers. I had loved that car because it meant we could go anywhere together. But after he passed, I could barely bring myself to start the engine. It became a relic of the life we once shared, a monument to the years before distance crept into our home. When Andrew visited last spring, he had stood in the garage with his hands in his pockets, shaking his head. "You should sell this thing, Mom. It's useless now." His tone had been casual, but I remembered the sting. He didn't see history when he looked at it, only rust. Maybe that was the first time I realized how differently we remembered the same things. Now, standing in the doorway, I ran my fingers over the hood, tracing the thin line of dust that had gathered there. My reflection wavered in the dull metal. The car smelled faintly of oil and old leather, the same scent that used to cling to my husband's jacket when he came in from the cold. I felt him beside me in that moment, the echo of his laugh still hiding somewhere in the silence. It took me another hour to make the call. The man who answered sounded polite and brisk. Classic car, you say? We'll take a look this afternoon. When the buyer arrived, he was younger than I expected, dressed in work boots and a heavy jacket. He circled the car with an appraising eye, nodding softly. She's got some age, he said, but the frame's solid. People don't build them like this anymore. I smiled faintly. No, they don't. He made an offer, fair enough that I didn't hesitate. Watching him count the bills, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't the money that mattered, but what it represented. A beginning, small and trembling, but mine alone. When the truck came to tow the car away, I stood on the porch, the cold wind biting at my face. As the engine started, the old Bel Air coughed to life one last time. The sound cut through the stillness, a rough but steady rhythm, as if it refused to leave quietly. My throat tightened. I stepped closer, resting a hand on the railing. You carried us once, I whispered. Now you'll carry me to freedom. The driver didn't hear me, but it didn't matter. The words were for the car, and maybe for my husband too. When the taillights disappeared down the street, the silence that followed didn't feel like loss. It felt like air. Inside, I placed the envelope of cash on the table next to the silver teapot and the ledger. The three of them together looked like pieces of a puzzle: the past, the truth, and the promise of what came next. I poured myself a cup of tea and let it cool in my hands, the warmth sinking slowly into my skin. Later that afternoon, I walked to the bank. The clerk at the counter recognized me and smiled. Mrs. Holden, how nice to see you. Are we making a deposit today? Yes, I said, but into a new account. In my name only. She nodded and began typing. The sound of the keys clicking was almost musical. As I signed the papers, I felt a steadying sense of control return, the kind that had been missing for too many years. My husband had once handled the finances, then Andrew took over when he passed. I had told myself it was easier that way, but easy had turned into invisible. When the clerk handed me the new card, I slid it into my wallet and felt its weight against my palm. It was just a piece of plastic, but it might as well have been a key. I walked home through the thin winter air, the streets damp with melting snow. Passing the used bookstore on the corner, I stopped for a moment to look inside. A couple stood by the window, laughing softly, their hands brushing as they turned the pages of a map. They reminded me of myself and my husband, years ago, planning drives up the coast. For a heartbeat, I felt that same ache of memory. Then, unexpectedly, it eased. By the time I reached home, dusk had fallen. The house no longer looked as cold as it once did. I left the porch light on and hung my coat carefully by the door. The space smelled faintly of lemon soap and something gentler, something alive. I brewed tea again and sat at the table, letting my mind settle. I thought about how strange freedom can feel at first, how it doesn't arrive like a storm, but like a slow thaw. I imagined my children coming home one day, looking for the car, expecting everything to be as they left it. I almost smiled at the thought. Outside, a few flakes of snow began to fall again, soft and light. I watched them through the window, falling into the darkness, melting before they touched the ground. I realized I wasn't mourning anymore. I was clearing space. When I went to bed that night, I left the blinds open so the moonlight could reach the walls. The room felt new somehow, unfamiliar but safe. For the first time in a long while, I didn't dream about being found. I dreamed about driving, the road wide and quiet before me, the sky opening like a promise. That night, after I sold the car and opened my new account, I walked through the quiet house with a feeling I could not yet name. It wasn't joy or even relief. It was something more deliberate, like standing at the edge of a decision that had been waiting for me all along. Every room looked the same, but I no longer saw it as home. It was a museum of my obedience, and I had finally stopped being its curator. The next morning, I opened the old wardrobe in my bedroom. Inside, stacked neatly beneath folded blankets, was a worn leather box. I lifted it carefully, brushing off a thin film of dust. The box creaked open to reveal what I was looking for: the family photo album. It was thick with years of captured smiles and staged happiness, its spine slightly cracked, corners soft from handling. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it beside the teapot. For a long time, I just looked at it. The cover was faded blue, the kind that used to shine when my husband first bought it. I remembered the afternoon we started filling it, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing as we argued over which pictures to include. "One day," he said, "our children will look through this and remember how loved they were." The irony of that sentence pressed against my chest as I opened the first page. There we were, younger and hopeful, smiling against a backdrop of summer fields. My husband held baby Andrew in his arms, his eyes full of pride. A few pages later, Rebecca appeared, her curls wild and golden, laughing so wide her gums showed. Each photograph felt like a lie that used to be true. I turned the pages slowly, and the story of our family unfolded before me. Christmas mornings, with wrapping paper strewn across the floor. Birthdays with candles that melted too fast. School recitals where I sat in the front row, camera shaking in my hands. Every photo glowed with the illusion of permanence. Yet beneath it, I could feel what had been slipping away year after year. Halfway through, I stopped at one particular picture. It was from a Christmas long ago, the last one before my husband's heart failed. Andrew was carving the turkey, pretending not to notice his father watching proudly from the other end of the table. Rebecca was laughing at something her uncle had said, her hand resting absent-mindedly on mine. It had been the last time we were all truly together. The last night the house had felt whole. I sat there for a long time, my fingers trembling on the edge of the page. Then I reached for an envelope. I had prepared it that morning, though I hadn't yet admitted to myself why. Inside were the photocopies of the credit card statements, each one marked with their careless spending. The paper crackled softly as I slid it inside the album. Before closing it, I took a blank sheet of stationery and wrote in ink that bled slightly through the fibers. "While I lay in a hospital bed, you ordered champagne. You left me behind, so I am leaving first." I paused after writing it, reading the words aloud in a whisper. They sounded foreign, too cold, but they were true. Truth has a way of stripping the sweetness out of memory. I folded the note neatly and slipped it into the envelope with the statements. Then I placed it between two photographs, one from a Christmas morning, the other from Rebecca's piano recital. It was the perfect place, tucked between what they had been and what they had become. When I closed the album, I ran my hand across the cover, tracing the faint indent of the title pressed into the leather, Holden Family. For a second, I almost laughed. Families were supposed to hold, weren't they? But some only take. I stood, carrying the album back to the living room. The shelves along the wall were lined with books, framed photographs, and trinkets from vacations long past. I chose a spot high enough that it wouldn't be noticed right away. The place where Andrew always said he would hang new family pictures, but never did. I slid the album in carefully and stepped back. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now. The act of placing that envelope inside the album didn't bring closure. It brought clarity. It was as if I had given the truth a home of its own, somewhere it could rest until the day they finally came looking. Later that evening, I sat by the window watching the sky fade into gray. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. Mrs. Grant's kitchen glowed warmly across the street. I wondered if she was baking again. The smell of her bread sometimes drifted through the air when the wind blew just right. I closed my eyes and thought of my husband again. I could almost hear his voice. "You've done enough, Margaret," he would have said. "You don't need to keep proving love to people who don't remember what it looks like." I whispered into the quiet, "I know." When I opened my eyes, I felt a strange steadiness, like something inside me had locked into place. The ledger had been the record of betrayal, but the album, this was something else. It was the moment I stopped asking for acknowledgement and started writing the ending myself. I left the lights on that night, not out of fear, but because I wanted to see the walls around me clearly. Everything inside this house had once been built for them, every corner echoing their laughter, every shelf arranged for their approval. Now, for the first time, it belonged to me. And somewhere deep down, though I could not name it yet, I knew that hiding the truth in that album was only the beginning of what I was about to do. After hiding the envelope in the photo album, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. Truth does not sit quietly once it's written down. It lingers, whispering, asking to be seen. Each time I walked past that shelf, I felt the weight of it, humming like a secret heartbeat behind the wood. The ledger had been about acknowledgement. The album was about judgment. But what came next was about release. A month passed before I made my final decision. The days were long, but not lonely anymore. There was something powerful about reclaiming time after spending decades giving it away. I woke when I wanted, cooked only what I could finish, and spoke out loud to no one without apology. Yet even as I found comfort in silence, the house began to feel smaller. I noticed every creak in the floor, every photograph that no longer brought warmth but accusation. The rooms were heavy with memory, and memory, I realized, can be its own kind of prison. One afternoon, as I was dusting the bookshelf, my hand brushed the album again. I paused, tracing its spine. The thought came suddenly, sharp and certain. This house has served its purpose. That evening, I called a realtor. Her voice on the other end was brisk and professional, but kind. Her name was Monica. "You said the address is on Maplewood Lane, Mrs. Holden? Lovely area. What made you decide to sell?" I hesitated. The truth was too complicated for a stranger, so I said simply, "I'm ready to start over." She came 2 days later, efficient in her movements, clipboard in hand. "Solid structure," she said, walking through the living room. "With a bit of renovation, this could fetch a fine price." Her words were about walls and market value, but mine were about ghosts. "Then let's sell it quickly," I told her. Within a week, she found a young couple, newly married, bright-eyed and eager. They walked through the house holding hands, laughing softly as they imagined a future here. I watched them from the doorway, unnoticed. Their voices filled the air in a way that reminded me of years long past, when laughter had lived here too. For a brief, fleeting second, I felt a tug of something tender. Then it passed. When the papers were signed, I stayed one final night. The house was already half empty, the shelves bare, except for the teapot and a few boxes stacked near the wall. I walked through every room slowly, my footsteps echoing. I ran my hand along the banister, the same one my husband once polished each spring. I stood in the doorway of my children's old bedrooms, remembering the sound of their breathing when they were small. The house was still beautiful in the dark, even stripped of its comfort. I whispered a quiet goodbye to each space as I passed it, not out of sentiment, but out of respect. I was leaving behind a version of myself that had existed only within these walls. At dawn, I loaded my last suitcase into the cab and looked back. The porch light was still on. I almost turned it off but didn't. Let them find it glowing, a silent signal that this home had once been filled with love, and that love had finally walked away. When my children returned from Europe a week later, I was already gone. I was not there to see it, but I can imagine it clearly. The car pulling up to the curb, the wheels crunching against the gravel. The house stood unchanged from the outside, except for the bright red SOLD sign posted on the lawn. The grass had grown a little, but the air smelled fresh, like rain. Rebecca must have stepped out first. I can see her perfectly in my mind. Her hair tied up, sunglasses perched on her head, phone still in her hand. She would have paused at the sight of the sign, her lips parting in disbelief. "Daniel," she probably called. "Why does it say sold?" Daniel, always the confident one, would have laughed it off at first, muttering that there must be some mistake. But when he reached into his pocket and pulled out his key, the laughter would have died. The key slid in, then stopped. He tried again. The lock resisted. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the porch. He jiggled it harder, cursed under his breath, and stepped back. "Something's wrong," he might have said. Rebecca joined him, trying her own key, pressing her face against the window. Inside, the rooms were empty, the curtains gone, the walls bare. Even the piano had disappeared. "It's empty," she would have whispered, her voice small. "Everything's gone." Panic must have settled between them then, quick and hot. I can imagine the children in the back seat growing restless, asking where Grandma was. The air must have turned sharp with confusion and guilt, both of them trying to reason through something they didn't yet understand. That was when they would have seen it, the note taped neatly to the front door. It was written in my own careful handwriting, the same steady script that had once signed their school permission slips, their birthday cards, their mortgage papers. "The house no longer belongs to you, because it never did." I did not need to be there to hear their silence, the kind that crushes words before they form. I knew Daniel would read it twice, maybe 3 times, trying to make sense of it, his jaw tightening with every line. Rebecca would stand beside him, her eyes darting between the note and the empty windows. Mrs. Grant later told me she saw them that afternoon, standing in the driveway, looking lost. "They seemed shocked," she said gently. like people who expected to walk into a dream but found a locked door instead. I thanked her for telling me, though I already knew how it must have felt. To lose something you assumed was yours is far crueler than never having it at all. That night, in the small seaside cottage where I now lived, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine. I could almost hear the waves breaking against the rocks. Somewhere, miles away, my children were standing outside an empty house, and for once, they were the ones waiting. I didn't smile. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, but peace. The kind that comes only when you realize that justice, when quiet, is its own kind of mercy. And in that stillness, I understood something deeper. I had not just sold a house. I had sold the last illusion of belonging to people who never truly saw me. I had thought they might never come. Some part of me hoped they wouldn't. The quiet life I had built in Camden was still fragile, like a seashell pressed too hard in your hand. Every morning I walked along the shoreline, the cold air wrapping around me like a second skin. I had learned to breathe again here. The waves spoke in a rhythm I understood, neither accusing nor forgiving, only constant. It was a Sunday afternoon when I first heard the sound of tires on gravel. The noise sliced through the steady song of the sea. I froze by the window, my teacup halfway to my lips. For a moment, I thought it might be Mrs. Grant visiting from town. Then, I saw the car. It was dark, sleek, and out of place among the weathered fishermen's trucks that usually lined the road. The doors slammed, voices followed. Angry, hurried, familiar. By the time I opened the door, Andrew was already halfway up the porch steps. His face was flushed, his hair disheveled as if he had driven straight from the city without stopping. Rebecca trailed behind, her expression tight, her eyes red from crying. "Mom," Andrew barked, pushing past me into the cottage. "What the hell is going on? The locks are changed, the house is empty, the car is gone. Where is everything?" I shut the door quietly behind him, the sound almost tender compared to his storming voice. "Sit down if you like," I said, "but I won't be yelled at in my own home." He turned to face me, his hands clenched at his sides. "Our home, you mean?" he shot back. "No," I said, my voice steady as stone. "Not yours, not anymore." Rebecca stepped forward then, her tone softer, pleading. "Mom, how could you do this? We came back expecting you to be there, waiting for us. We thought you'd forgive us." I looked down at my teacup. The silver teapot beside it caught the light, throwing back a reflection of all three of us in warped fragments. "I did forgive you," I said, lifting my gaze. "But forgiveness doesn't mean access." They both stared at me, unsure what to say. I could see the confusion turning into something else in Andrew's eyes, shame disguised as anger. "You can't just cut us off like this," he said finally, his voice rising. "We're your children." "Children," I repeated softly. That word used to mean something. When you were small, I fed you, clothed you, held you when you were sick. I would have given my life for you. But now, you're not children. You're adults who made choices. And one of those choices was to leave your mother alone in a hospital bed while you drank champagne in Italy. Rebecca flinched as if struck. It wasn't like that. We didn't know how serious it was. I leaned forward, my hands folded in my lap. "You knew enough to take my credit card with you." The room fell silent, except for the sound of the wind outside brushing against the windows. The ocean roared faintly in the distance, steady and relentless. I reached for the folded letter on the table and placed it between us. "This is my will," I said. "Every penny, every account, every remaining dollar now belongs to the Forgotten Mothers Foundation. It helps women like me, women who have spent a lifetime giving without being seen." Andrew's jaw tightened. "You're punishing us." I shook my head slowly. "No, I'm releasing you. You never wanted responsibility, only reassurance. Consider this freedom." Rebecca began to cry quietly. "We thought you'd always be there," she whispered. "We thought you'd understand." "I do," I said. "I understand that you loved the idea of me, not the reality. The idea of a mother who never asks, never expects, who waits endlessly at the window for her children to remember her." Andrew moved toward the door, then stopped. "You're making a mistake, Mom. When you're gone, you'll regret this." "I already was gone," I replied. "And you didn't notice." He froze, the truth hitting him harder than any raised voice ever could. Rebecca covered her face, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but I stayed still. I had learned that sometimes love must stay seated, or it risks being mistaken for permission. For a long while, none of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking every second of their disbelief. Finally, Andrew turned to leave. "You've changed," he said bitterly. "Yes," I said, at last. When the door closed behind them, I exhaled. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strange lightness that follows a confession long withheld. Through the window, I saw them standing by the car. Rebecca was wiping her eyes, and Andrew was speaking to her, his gestures sharp, impatient. I imagined the words between them: shock, anger, blame, but they could no longer reach me. The car engine started, then faded down the winding road until there was nothing left but the sound of the sea. I sat back down and poured myself another cup of tea. The steam rose in thin white curls, the teapot gleamed in the late afternoon light. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain myself to anyone. The house I had left behind was theirs to remember, but this small cottage by the sea was mine to live in. I watched the horizon through the window as the sun began to sink. The waves rolled and broke in patterns older than regret. I thought of all the mothers sitting in quiet rooms across the world, waiting for calls that would not come, believing that love meant endurance. Maybe they would hear this story someday. Maybe they would understand that peace does not come from being needed, but from learning to need nothing. The kettle whistled softly behind me. I poured one last cup of tea, the warmth curling through my fingers, and whispered to the quiet. They finally learned how it feels to knock and not be let in. Outside, the tide began to rise, washing the shoreline clean. After that afternoon, the days in Camden began to move differently. The silence no longer pressed against the windows like a threat. It breathed. I learned to measure time not by the ticking of clocks, but by the movement of the sea. Each tide that came and went seemed to wash away the remnants of what I had carried for too long. Weeks later, I still sit on my porch every evening. The sea air is thick with salt and the faint scent of lavender from Mrs. Grant's garden. The world feels smaller here, but also truer. The silver teapot that once sat lifeless on my kitchen counter now holds fresh daisies, their stems wrapped in cool water. The light catches on the metal each afternoon, scattering reflections across the porch floor. I sometimes imagine that my husband would have liked this view, the endless line where water meets sky. The children from next door come often now. They call me Grandma Maggie, though we share no blood. At first, they came shyly, holding shells and driftwood as offerings. Now, they arrive in bursts of laughter, their shoes tracking sand across my porch. They ask for stories before the sun goes down. Sometimes I tell them about growing up in the Midwest, sometimes about my husband, and sometimes I make up tales about the sea and the spirits that guard it. When they laugh, their voices rise into the air and echo against the cliffs. It sounds like music, the kind I had forgotten existed. One evening, as the sun turned the water gold, the youngest girl, Clara, pointed to the teapot and asked, "Why do you keep flowers in something for tea?" I smiled. "Because it used to hold what I gave to everyone else. Now it holds something for me." She thought about that for a while, before running off to chase her brother through the dunes. I watched her go and felt a calm settle over me. The teapot had once poured out warmth until it was empty. Now, it was full again, in its own way. Mrs. Grant visits sometimes in the afternoons, bringing jars of jam or warm bread. We sit together without needing to fill every silence. She talks about her roses, about the town gossip, about the gulls that steal her laundry from the line. I listen and smile, grateful for the simplicity of it. Connection, I've learned, doesn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes it's enough just to have someone who knocks before entering. I've received a few letters from Andrew and Rebecca since they left the cottage. The first ones were angry, filled with disbelief and wounded pride. The later ones were shorter, quieter. They spoke of confusion, then reflection. I have not replied yet. I keep their letters in a small wooden box beside my bed. Maybe one day I will read them again. Maybe one day I will answer, but not yet. Forgiveness, I have found, has no deadline. It blooms in its own season, like wildflowers on the cliffs, unexpected, stubborn, and soft. Some nights, I sit awake long after the moon has risen, listening to the waves strike the rocks. The sound no longer reminds me of loneliness. It reminds me of endurance. I think of the countless mothers who wait in dimly lit kitchens, their hands resting on tables, their eyes on doors that never open. I wish I could tell each of them what I have learned. Peace is not something that arrives with an apology. It is something you claim when you stop asking permission to exist. I am 74 now, and my reflection no longer startles me. The lines around my mouth are stories, not scars. The softness of my hands speaks of care, not weakness. When I pour water into the teapot each morning for the daisies, I watch how the petals lift, how the stems lean toward the light. There is a lesson in that too. Sometimes, when the breeze carries the sound of children playing, I close my eyes and imagine my own at that age, before the sharpness of the world found them, before they learned to confuse love with possession. I do not wish them pain. I wish them clarity. Perhaps one day they will understand that losing everything they took for granted was the beginning of what they needed most. The chance to see me not as an endless source, but as a person who once gave and finally chose to keep something for herself. The sea has its own memory. Every wave that reaches the shore pulls something away, then returns with something new. I have started to live like that. Each day, I let go a little more of what hurt, and in its place, I find something unexpected. Laughter, gratitude, quiet joy. This morning, I brewed tea for the first time in months. I used the small ceramic pot, not the silver one. I poured a single cup, no sugar, no milk, just the sharp taste of leaves steeped in boiling water. I lifted it slowly and whispered a thank you into the steam. Not to anyone in particular, just to the life that had waited for me all this time. I know there are people who will never understand what I did, who will call it selfish or cruel. But the truth is simple. I did not walk away to hurt anyone. I walked away to remember who I was before I forgot myself in service of others. Sometimes leaving is not abandonment. Sometimes it is arrival. The sun is setting again as I write this. The children are calling to each other down by the shore. Mrs. Grant's window glows faintly across the street. The daisies in the teapot have begun to open wider, their white petals catching the last light. I will replace them tomorrow with new ones, but tonight I let them stay, soft and still, a reminder of what can bloom in a vessel once thought empty. I used to think peace was something you waited for. Now I know it is something you choose, again and again, until it becomes the rhythm of your own heartbeat. If you have ever loved too deeply and been forgotten, tell your story. Somewhere, someone is listening, and your voice, even trembling, might be the light another person is waiting to see. In the end, Margaret did not need an apology, or even understanding. What she needed was peace, and she found it in the quiet rhythm of the waves, in a small cottage that finally felt like her own. She learned that love is not proven by how long you wait, but by how bravely you let go. Peace isn't given by others. It's reclaimed by the heart that finally stops begging to be seen. If this story touched something in you, take a breath and share a piece of your own. Tell us where you're watching from, and what part of Margaret's journey stayed with you the most. Your story might comfort someone who needs it tonight. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter for more true stories of courage, dignity, and healing. And next time, we'll open another door to a woman who kept one secret for 50 years and chose the perfect moment to tell it.